October 24, 1944, Sibuyan Sea, Central Philippines. The morning sky was a bruised gray when the first wave of American aircraft appeared over the horizon. From the decks of Japan's most powerful battleship, Musashi, sailors looked up into a sound that seemed to shake the ocean itself. The deep roar of hundreds of engines, growing louder with every heartbeat. In the humid air, the sea shimmered like glass. Then the silence broke. Dozens of Curtiss helldivers plunged from the clouds, their dive sirens screaming through the mist. The first bombs hit close. Columns of water rose higher than the bridge tower. Seconds later, others found their mark. Metal shrieked. Fire rolled across the deck. Men ran, barefoot on burning steel, shouting commands lost in the thunder of explosions. From the bridge, Admiral Takeo Kurita watched in disbelief as one of the world's largest warships, pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, was being torn apart by waves of U.S. carrier planes. By dusk, the ocean was littered with oil, debris, and bodies. The mighty Musashi slipped beneath the waves, and Japan's admirals were left staring into the sea, stunned by how swiftly air power had erased centuries of naval tradition. By mid-1944, the Pacific Ocean had become a graveyard of empires. 2 years earlier, Japan had ruled it with near impunity, stretching from the jungles of Burma to the shores of New Guinea, from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands. But by the autumn of 1944, that empire was unraveling. The United States had turned the tide. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor rose an industrial colossus that built aircraft carriers faster than Japan could sink them, trained pilots by the thousands, and flooded the Pacific with machines of war. Island by island, step by step, American forces clawed their way westward, through Guadalcanal, Tarawa, the Marshalls, Saipan, and Guam, each battle pushing Japan closer to home. When Admiral Chester W. Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur met to plan the next move, the target was clear: the Philippines. Retaking these islands would cut Japan's vital supply lines from Southeast Asia, severing the oil and resources that kept its war machine alive. MacArthur had vowed to return since his forced evacuation in 1942, and in October 1944, that promise was about to be fulfilled. On the Japanese side, desperation had replaced confidence. The Imperial Navy, once the most feared in Asia, was now bleeding ships and pilots. Its air groups were shattered after the Battle of the Philippine Sea just months earlier, a defeat so one-sided that U.S. pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Yet Tokyo refused to yield. If the Philippines fell, Japan's southern empire, Indonesia, Malaya, Borneo, would be cut off from its last oil fields. Defeat there would mean starvation, isolation, and the collapse of the nation's war effort. In the final months of 1944, Japan prepared for a single massive counterstroke, a gamble so bold it bordered on suicide. It would throw nearly every remaining capital ship into one coordinated operation designed to crush the American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf. The plan, codenamed Operation Shogo 1, divided Japan's surviving warships into 3 forces. The Northern Force, a decoy fleet of aircraft carriers stripped nearly bare of planes, would lure Admiral Halsey's powerful carrier groups northward. The Southern Force would attack through the Sulu Sea to strike Leyte from below. And in the center, Admiral Takeo Kurita would lead the center force, the largest and most powerful of all, including Yamato and Musashi, the 2 largest battleships ever built. If Kurita could break through the Sibuyan Sea, sweep past the narrow San Bernardino Strait, and strike into Leyte Gulf, he could annihilate the vulnerable American transports landing troops on the beaches. It was a plan built on perfect timing, deception, and an enormous gamble, one final attempt to reverse the course of the war. But what Japan didn't fully grasp was that the era of the battleship had already ended. By late 1944, the true rulers of the ocean were no longer ships of steel, but swarms of aircraft launched from floating airfields hundreds of miles away. While Kurita's force moved through the narrow Philippine passages, American carrier task forces, commanded by Admiral William Bull Halsey and Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, were prowling nearby, guided by radar, reconnaissance aircraft, and code-breaking intelligence that often revealed Japan's movements before their ships were even seen. As the sun rose on October 23, Kurita's massive armada, 5 battleships, 10 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers and 15 destroyers, entered the Sibuyan Sea, unaware that American scouts had already spotted them. What began as a bold strike would soon become a day of destruction, when air power would show the world that even the greatest battleships could not survive the skies. In Tokyo's naval headquarters, the architects of Operation Shogo One knew the plan was desperate. Their fleets were scattered, their air cover thin, and fuel reserves critically low. But on paper, it offered one last chance to strike a fatal blow against the U.S. invasion of the Philippines. The Japanese High Command divided its remaining fleet into 4 main thrusts. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa led the northern force. For carriers with barely 100 aircraft, little more than a decoy meant to draw the Americans north. To the south, Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura and Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima commanded battleships and cruisers intended to converge through the Surigao Strait. At the heart of it all, Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, the most powerful, was to break through the Sibuyan Sea, cross the San Bernardino Strait, and fall upon the unprotected transports in Leyte Gulf. It was a masterstroke of deception, but one crippled by reality. Japan's once formidable air power had been annihilated in the Marianas. With only scattered land-based squadrons remaining, Kurita would face the full strength of U.S. carrier aviation alone. Even so, he commanded immense firepower. 5 battleships, including Yamato and Musashi, both displacing over 70,000 tons, 10 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 15 destroyers. Together they formed a floating fortress, more armor and artillery than any fleet afloat. At dawn on October 22, 1944, Kurita's ships slipped out of Brunei Bay, Borneo, under cover of tropical rain. They steamed north and east, threading through narrow channels toward the Philippines. Sailors crowded the decks, staring toward the horizon where the sky glowed faintly over the Sibuyan Sea. Many knew this might be their final voyage. The American landings at Leyte had begun 2 days earlier. General MacArthur waded ashore on October 20th, declaring, "People of the Philippines, I have returned." Behind him stretched an armada of over 700 ships, transports, destroyers, battleships, and carriers, supporting the liberation of an entire nation. To protect this vast invasion fleet, the U.S. Navy deployed 2 massive formations. Admiral Thomas Kinkaid's 7th Fleet, covering the landing operations close to shore. Admiral William Bull Halsey's 3rd Fleet, farther east, centered around the powerful fast carrier Task Force 38, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitcher. Together, these forces represented the most formidable naval power ever assembled. Their air groups numbered over 1,000 aircraft fighters, torpedo bombers, and dive bombers, each trained to operate with precision from the decks of modern carriers like Essex, Intrepid, Lexington, and Enterprise. Unlike Japan's shrinking navy, the U.S. could replace every lost plane within days and every fallen pilot within weeks. As Kurita's fleet moved closer to the central Philippines, it was spotted almost immediately. At dawn on October 23rd, the U.S. submarine USS Darter detected radar signals from the approaching Japanese column near Palawan Island. Moments later, USS Dace joined the contact. The submarines slipped into firing position and unleashed their torpedoes. Explosions ripped through the Japanese heavy cruisers Atago and Maya, sinking both, while Takeo was left crippled and forced to retreat. Kurita himself barely escaped the destruction, plucked from the sea after his flagship Atago went down. When he resumed command aboard Yamato, his nerves were shaken but his orders unchanged: continue toward the Sibuyan Sea. For the Americans, this confirmed their worst fears and greatest opportunity. The Imperial Navy was moving in full force. Admiral Halsey's carrier groups launched long-range scouts and patrols, tracking every movement from the sky. The message flashed through every ship in Task Force 38. Enemy fleet sighted, Sibuyan Sea. On the morning of October 24th, as the first light touched the waters between the Philippines' central islands, hundreds of U.S. aircraft began to circle above their carriers, engines rumbling. Below deck, pilots studied reconnaissance photos pinned to briefing boards, outlines of Yamato-class battleships, cruisers, and destroyers marked with red arrows. They were about to strike the most powerful surface fleet Japan had left. What followed would not be a battle between ships, but between eras, where the might of gunfire met the supremacy of the air. And at its center stood Musashi, steaming into history. 1. The human angle. For the sailors aboard Musashi, the morning of October 24th began like many others. Breakfast of rice and pickles, a humid wind cutting across the decks, the faint tang of oil in the air. But by midday everything had changed. When the first alarms echoed through the ship, thousands of men rushed to their battle stations. Gunners scrambled to turrets, loaders heaved shells, and signalmen shouted bearings to the bridge. The sky above the Sibuyan Sea filled with black puffs of anti-aircraft fire, each one a desperate attempt to swat down the American planes now descending like hawks. Some sailors prayed softly as the first bombs fell. Others cursed through clenched teeth, gripping the handrails as explosions shook the steel beneath their feet. On the American side, the men in the cockpits of Hellcats, Helldivers, and Avengers felt no sense of triumph, only focus. They were young, many barely in their 20s, flying hundreds of miles over open sea, relying on fuel calculations and trust in their squadrons. Each mission meant threading through flak bursts so dense they looked like black rain. Every dive was a pact with death. Pull up too late and the sea would take you. Too early and your bomb would miss. For both sides, it was a test of endurance, not just courage. Japanese sailors fought with the fatalistic calm of men raised in a culture that prized duty above life. American pilots fought with precision born from training and an industrial engine that refused to lose. Between them stretched a gulf of belief. Yet each was bound by the same human truth: fear, duty, and the hope to live another hour. 2. The tactical angle. Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 38 was the most efficient naval strike machine in history. Its doctrine turned the ocean into a chessboard, one where aircraft moved faster than any ship could think. When the Sibuyan Sea contact reports came in that morning, orders flashed instantly across radio circuits. Each carrier prepared its own strike wave: F-6F Hellcats for fighter cover, SB-2C Helldivers for dive bombing, TBF Avengers for torpedo runs. Within minutes, over 250 aircraft were airborne, each armed, fueled, and coordinated through a complex system of timing and altitude separation. They would arrive over the target in 3 separate waves, ensuring continuous pressure and confusion for the enemy. Tactically, the U.S. advantage was more than numbers. Radar allowed early detection. Trained coordination ensured each strike hit like a hammer. While Japan's fleet still fought under line-of-sight and flag signals, the Americans fought by data and discipline. Every pilot knew his timing, his target type, and his escape route. Communication was constant. Calm voices relaying positions, altitudes, and bomb impacts, turning chaos into orchestration. Below, on Musashi's bridge, Japanese spotters tried to count the attacking squadrons, but the sky never cleared. When one wave finished its assault, another appeared from the clouds. Kurita's formation scattered, maneuvering violently to avoid torpedoes, but every evasive turn slowed their advance and drew the fleet deeper into a gauntlet of destruction. The Sibuyan Sea became a killing field, not of ships firing at each other, but of relentless precision strikes that broke the very concept of surface warfare. 3. The technological angle. At its heart, the battle was a confrontation between eras, the gun age versus the air age. Japan's Yamato-class battleships, Musashi among them, were technological marvels of the 1930s, built in secrecy, armored with steel thicker than any shell could penetrate. They carried 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval artillery ever mounted. Each shell weighed nearly 1.5 tons and could strike targets over 20 miles away. To the Japanese, Musashi was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of national pride, proof that craftsmanship and will could forge invincibility. But by 1944, the world had changed. Aircraft had become the new artillery. A single TBF Avenger, carrying a 2,000-pound bomb or torpedo, could do what no naval gun ever could: strike from beyond the horizon with precision and speed. The Americans had perfected this science. Their carriers acted as mobile airfields, with deck crews trained like clockwork to refuel, rearm, and launch planes in under 5 minutes. Their aircraft used advanced radio coordination and gyro-stabilized bomb sights, making them deadly even against moving targets. Every feature of the U.S. system, from radar detection to pilot debriefing, represented industrial warfare elevated to art. Against that, even Musashi's unmatched armor began to fail. Each bomb that struck her deck shattered seams, tore fittings, and spread flames through compartments designed for a different kind of war. No amount of steel could withstand hours of sustained assault from the sky. And yet, amid this technological imbalance, there remained a certain grim poetry. One side, the old empire of steel, the other, the rising empire of the sky, both meeting in one sea on one day to decide the fate of the Pacific. As the sun climbed higher, both forces braced for what was to come. The Americans prepared the next wave. Kurita's sailors readied their guns once more. The battle was far from over. The storm had only begun. 4. The leadership angle. In the command rooms of two navies, leadership meant more than orders. It meant judgment under the crushing weight of history. For Admiral Takeo Kurita, the commander of Japan's center force, the mission had begun in confidence. He was a veteran survivor of Midway, strategist of surface combat, and believer in the supremacy of battleships. But the sinking of his flagship Takeo by U.S. submarines the day before had shaken him deeply. Now aboard Yamato, he faced an unrelenting assault he could neither counter nor fully comprehend. Kurita's problem was not cowardice, it was doctrine. Japan's naval philosophy still clung to decisive surface engagement, the idea that one grand clash of battleships would decide the war. But by 1944, that world was gone. What Kurita commanded was not a weapon of decision, but a relic of a fading era, moving through waters controlled by the enemy's unseen air fleets. His every maneuver was constrained by fuel shortages, outdated reconnaissance, and communication delays. Even as he tried to press forward, the storm of American air power fractured his formation, forcing him into defense instead of advance. On the U.S. side, leadership looked entirely different. Admiral William Bull Halsey and Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher embodied a new kind of command, one that relied on coordination, speed, and technological trust. They did not chase battle lines. They directed systems. Halsey's aggressive instinct had been forged at Guadalcanal and the Solomons, but now it was channeled through the discipline of carrier warfare. Mitcher, calm and precise, oversaw operations from the flag bridge of the Lexington, his voice steady even as reports poured in of hits and fires below. Every strike wave launched that day was a product of leadership that fused planning with improvisation. While Kurita sought to hold formation under fire, Mitcher allowed his squadrons freedom of attack, trusting the judgment of his pilots and the rhythm of their training. It was command through confidence, not control. And it worked. 5. The moral angle. War at sea is often faceless. Ships vanish over the horizon. Men die unseen. But in the Sibuyan Sea, morality had faces, names, and voices. For Japan's sailors, fighting aboard ships like Musashi, Yamato, and Nagato, the mission was sacred. Their oath to the emperor left no room for surrender. They believed they were defending the soul of their nation, even if it meant certain death. As flames tore through compartments and flooding swallowed lower decks, many refused to abandon their posts. Some, trapped in engine rooms, continued to feed ammunition to the guns above until the lights went out. Yet, their courage was matched by the Americans. Men who risked their lives hundreds of miles from safety, flying into flak storms so dense that even returning alive felt like a miracle. They did not fight for empire or emperor. They fought to end a war that had begun with surprise and humiliation at Pearl Harbor. Each side saw honor differently, but in the Sibuyan Sea, both learned the same truth. Modern war leaves no room for valor untouched by tragedy. The moral contrast was profound. Japan's sailors fought to preserve a world already dying, a code of discipline rooted in centuries of warrior tradition. The Americans fought to secure a future defined by machines, production, and momentum. And as the bombs fell, the war became less about right and wrong, and more about endurance, who could outlast the storm of history. 6. The natural angle. While men planned, the sea and sky wrote their own script. The Sibuyan Sea was a mirror that day, calm, glassy, deceptive. For the American pilots, it was perfect bombing weather, clear visibility, minimal wind, stable approach angles. For the Japanese, it was a curse. No mist to hide beneath, no storm to scatter the attackers. Only a wide expanse of open water that left every ship exposed. The sun hung directly above the horizon during the heaviest attacks, dazzling gunners who fired blindly into the light. Bombs struck near the waterline, sending shockwaves through hulls already weakened by earlier hits. Each detonation rolled across the sea like thunder, echoing through the surrounding islands. Even nature seemed to amplify the Americans' dominance, the calmness of the waves reflecting the inevitability of change. By afternoon, the weather began to shift. Dark clouds built over the western horizon, and rain started to fall. But it was too late. The damage had been done, and the Japanese fleet was bleeding oil into the sea. Musashi listed slowly, her crew fighting to keep her afloat, while the remaining ships limped toward San Bernardino Strait. The ocean had witnessed countless battles, but few with such symbolism, where technology, will, and nature converged to mark the end of an age. The sea that had once carried Japan's empire now swallowed its pride. As dusk neared, Kurita's decision loomed: press on toward Leyte, or turn back and regroup. The fleet was battered but not yet broken, and the next hours would decide everything. The first wave came just before 10:30 a.m. American scouts had shadowed Kurita's fleet for hours, broadcasting its position to every carrier in range. When the orders came, hundreds of pilots strapped in, engines roaring across decks slick with fuel and sweat. The decks of USS Essex, USS Intrepid, USS Lexington, and USS Enterprise thundered with takeoffs, one plane every 15 seconds. At 10:30, the first formations sighted their prey. Below them stretched the Sibuyan Sea, calm and blue, dotted with the silver glint of Japanese warships. 5 battleships, 10 cruisers, destroyers weaving in escort. At the center was the prize. The Musashi, immense and glistening, her armored hull carving a black wake through the water. She was nearly 900 feet long, a floating fortress armed with 9 18-inch guns and an aura of invincibility. As the Helldivers began their descent, Japanese gunners opened fire. Tracer rounds clawed the sky. Shells burst in black blossoms around the oncoming aircraft. But the Americans pressed in, one dive after another, bomb doors opening at 8,000 feet, payloads released in perfect rhythm. The first bombs splashed short, but then a torpedo found its mark, slamming into Musashi's starboard side. A second followed minutes later. The shock rippled through the ship, knocking men off their feet, rupturing fuel lines, flooding lower compartments. Admiral Kurita, aboard Yamato, watched in disbelief as columns of water rose hundreds of feet into the air around Musashi. Her anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with fire, over 100 barrels blazing, but the attackers came in endless waves. Each time a group pulled out of its dive, another appeared. For the first time, even Japan's most disciplined sailors felt the weight of helplessness. By noon, the second wave arrived, heavier, more coordinated, more merciless. American torpedo bombers attacked from both sides simultaneously, a maneuver designed to overwhelm the ship's defensive turning arc. Musashi could evade torpedoes from one direction but not two. Within minutes, 3 more torpedoes struck home, one forward, one amidships, and another aft. Her speed dropped to less than 10 knots. Smoke poured from her decks, and fires raged uncontrollably near the stern. Inside, damage control teams fought like men possessed. Flooding spread through the lower decks, forcing engineers to counterflood opposite compartments to maintain balance. But the measures came at a cost. Every ton of water pumped in made her sink lower, slowing her further. By early afternoon, the once mighty battleship was barely moving. Above her, American pilots circled, watching with grim fascination. Lieutenant Harold Buell, flying a Helldiver from the Intrepid, later wrote, "It was like hitting a mountain that refused to fall. Every pass drew more smoke, more flames, more explosions, but still Musashi refused to die." At 1:30 p.m., the third wave struck. Over 100 planes, drawn from multiple carrier groups, converged over the Sibuyan Sea. Coordinated attack runs hit nearly every major ship in Kurita's formation. The Yamato, Nagato, and Myoko took damage, but Musashi bore the brunt. More bombs found their mark. One punched through her forward deck, detonating deep inside the hull. Another struck near the bridge, killing scores of officers and gunners. Flames reached her ammunition stores, setting off secondary explosions that rocked the entire ship. Kurita, realizing the slaughter, ordered evasive maneuvers, the fleet to scatter and reassemble later. But the formation broke apart completely. Cruisers and destroyers turned in every direction, laying smoke screens that failed to hide their massive silhouettes from the circling aircraft above. The once imposing Japanese center force was now a disjointed cluster of ships under siege. By 3 p.m., a fourth and final wave arrived. These pilots had been briefed midair, rerouted from other missions as reports confirmed that Musashi still floated. They came in from the east, flying low under radar and struck with surgical precision. For more torpedoes slammed into her port side, capsizing the delicate balance the damaged crews had fought to maintain. Musashi began to list heavily to port. Her bow dipped. Flooded engine rooms went silent. Inside the ship, the crew struggled to save her. Men tried to plug torpedo holes with mattresses and scrap metal. Others fought fires with buckets as pumps failed. Still, Musashi listed further, 15 degrees, then 20, then 30. Officers shouted for counterflooding, but there was no power left to move the pumps. The sea had claimed the ship's heart. As night approached, Kurita made the decision no admiral ever wants to make, to abandon the wounded ship. Destroyers pulled alongside, rescuing survivors under constant threat of renewed air attack. Even then, the Japanese sailors refused to show panic. Witnesses later recalled them saluting as they left their posts, bowing toward the bridge, and stepping into the water with quiet dignity. At 7:35 p.m., Musashi rolled onto her side and slipped beneath the surface, taking over 1,000 men with her. The sea boiled as trapped air escaped from her shattered hull. Then silence, only drifting oil and debris where the world's largest battleship had been. That silence spread through the Japanese command chain like a shockwave. A ship once thought unsinkable, a masterpiece of steel and pride, was gone in less than a day. Kurita's fleet, battered but still afloat, pressed on toward the San Bernardino Strait, carrying both defiance and disbelief. As darkness fell over the Sibuyan Sea, the horizon glowed faintly with fire. The burning remains of Japanese ships drifted in silence, their oil slicks reflecting the fading light. The U.S. pilots returned to their carriers in triumph, exhausted, but knowing they had struck a blow no one had believed possible that morning. In their debriefs, they spoke of Musashi's agony, the endless explosions, and the eerie sight of the massive ship sinking slowly into the dark. On the flight decks, sailors cheered as reports came in. 5 Japanese battleships hit. One, the largest ever built, confirmed sunk. It was a staggering achievement. Never before in naval history had aircraft alone destroyed so much tonnage in a single day. Even the seasoned veterans aboard Enterprise and Lexington realized they were witnessing a turning point, the moment when air power completely eclipsed the age of the battleship. But for Admiral Takeo Kurita, still commanding what remained of the center force, the victory belonged to no one. He had lost Musashi, Myoko was crippled, and Yamato, though still afloat, was scarred. His communications were in disarray, his formations scattered. Yet orders from Tokyo were clear: press on. The combined fleet command still believed Kurita could reach the American invasion fleet off Leyte Gulf and strike a decisive counterblow. Kurita hesitated. His ships had burned tens of thousands of tons of fuel, ammunition was low, and anti-aircraft guns were nearly silent from overheating. But in the code of the Imperial Navy, hesitation was dishonor. So, after midnight, he reassembled what was left of his formation and pushed toward the San Bernardino Strait. Meanwhile, far to the north, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa prepared his northern force, a decoy built of empty carriers with almost no aircraft aboard. They were meant to lure Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet away from Leyte. It was a gamble so audacious it bordered on desperation. The Japanese High Command no longer had the ships or pilots to win a direct battle, so they bet everything on illusion. On October 25th, dawn revealed a stunning reversal of fates. Kurita's tattered fleet, now without its heaviest ship, had slipped through the strait unseen. Ahead of him lay Taffy 3, a small U.S. task group made up of escort carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts. Ships never intended to fight battleships. At 6:45 a.m., lookouts aboard the Fanshawe Bay spotted massive gun flashes on the horizon. Moments later, 18-inch shells from Yamato screamed overhead. The battle off Samar had begun. It was a nightmare of scale and courage, the largest battleships ever built chasing tiny, underarmed American ships. But those tin cans, as their crews called them, fought back with ferocity no one expected. Destroyers like Johnston and Hull charged headlong into the Japanese line, firing torpedoes and laying smoke. U.S. carrier planes, out of armor-piercing bombs, resorted to strafing runs with machine guns and even practice bombs. The sea boiled with tracers and torpedo wakes. From his bridge aboard Yamato, Kurita watched the chaos unfold. His fleet was winning on paper, yet confusion spread. Smoke screens, overlapping orders, and constant air harassment made it impossible to identify targets clearly. At 9:20 a.m., convinced he was facing a much larger American force, Kurita made the fateful decision to withdraw. It was over in hours. The Japanese Center Force, the last real concentration of Japan's surface fleet, turned back toward the Sibuyan Sea, never to threaten an American beachhead again. In Tokyo, reports came piecemeal. First, there was silence, then disbelief, and finally, the quiet realization that the Imperial Navy, once the pride of Asia, had been gutted. When word of Musashi's loss reached the Naval General Staff, Admiral Toyoda Somu, Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet, reportedly stood motionless for minutes. Witnesses recalled him staring at the map of the Philippines, his hand trembling slightly. The staff tried to assure him that Yamato still lived, that the center force had withdrawn in good order. But Toyoda understood what that meant. Japan's last battleship thrust had failed. Meanwhile, in underground bunkers in Tokyo, younger officers whispered the unthinkable, that the age of the battleship was over. Years of pride and sacrifice had been undone by aircraft launched from wooden decks hundreds of miles away. Japan had invested fortunes in armor, steel, and size, and all of it had sunk in a single afternoon. In the days that followed, Musashi's loss became a ghost story whispered among sailors. Her sister ship, Yamato, would meet the same fate months later. Proof that even the greatest war machines could be humbled by the evolution of warfare. To the Japanese Admiralty, it was not just a military loss. It was a psychological collapse. The empire had believed in invincibility. Now they had witnessed its death beneath the Sibuyan Sea. And as reports from Leyte confirmed Japan's defeat on land, the admirals in Tokyo gathered in somber meetings, facing the bitter truth. Their fleets could no longer protect the empire. Their skies belonged to the enemy. Their oceans, once symbols of power, had become graves. That realization set the stage for the final descent of the Imperial Navy, a collapse accelerated by the loss of fuel, ships, and hope itself. And in that silence after the storm, as Kurita's battered survivors limped back toward Brunei, one question lingered across every Japanese command post. If 5 battleships and 1,000 men could vanish in a single day, what could possibly stop the next wave? By the morning of October 26, 1944, the Sibuyan Sea was eerily calm again. The fires had burned out, the echoes of bombs had faded, and the wreckage of Musashi drifted beneath the waves. Oil slicks stretched for miles, shimmering across the surface, the last visible trace of one of Japan's proudest creations. U.S. reconnaissance planes circled above, photographing the devastation for intelligence reports. What they recorded would stun even the most seasoned naval commanders. In a single day, 250 American aircraft had crippled or sunk 5 Japanese battleships and cruisers, inflicted heavy damage on others, and shattered the cohesion of the Imperial Navy's center force. It was one of the most efficient and decisive air assaults in naval history. The U.S. losses were minimal, only a handful of planes and a few airmen missing, but the strategic implications were immense. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff attempted to frame the event as a tactical withdrawal, but the truth could not be hidden for long. Thousands of families across Japan received news of their sons lost with Musashi. The ship's commander, Vice Admiral Toshihira Inoguchi, had gone down with her, a traditional act of honor that symbolized both duty and despair. His decision would later be praised in propaganda, but privately many officers saw it as an omen. A generation of admirals was dying with their ships. The psychological impact was profound. For years, the Japanese Navy had been built on the belief that battleships were the ultimate instruments of victory, the physical embodiment of the nation's will. But now, those floating fortresses had been rendered obsolete by airplanes launched hundreds of miles away. It wasn't just a defeat. It was the end of an entire philosophy of war. In Washington, news of the victory electrified the Navy Department. For Admiral William Halsey and Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, it validated everything they had fought to prove, that carrier aviation was the future, and air superiority was the key to controlling the Pacific. Reports from the Task Force 38 command showed that the U.S. had achieved near-total dominance of the skies over the Philippines. Japan's surface fleet was broken. Its pilots, once among the world's best, were now outnumbered and outtrained. At sea, the survivors of Musashi floated for hours before being rescued by Japanese destroyers. Many were burned or wounded, covered in oil. Of the ship's 2,399 crew, more than 1,000 had perished. Some survivors later described the silence on deck as the ship began to roll. No screams, no panic, just resignation. To them, Musashi had been more than a ship. She was a symbol of Japan's strength. Watching her sink felt like watching the empire itself slide into darkness. American intelligence soon intercepted Japanese communications confirming Musashi's loss. When the data reached Pearl Harbor, a brief message was filed under Victory Report, Sibuyan Sea. But even as the U.S. celebrated, the analysts understood something deeper. This wasn't merely a tactical win. It was proof that Japan could no longer replace its losses. Every ship sunk was irreplaceable. Every pilot lost impossible to train anew. Meanwhile, at sea, Kurita's battered force limped back toward Brunei, shadowed by submarines and aircraft. He had lost the core of his power and with it, the initiative. In his log, he wrote bitterly, "We fought to the limit of human endurance. The enemy's strength in the air was beyond imagination." For a man who had commanded some of the finest ships ever built, it was an admission of defeat wrapped in exhaustion. By late October, the Battle of Leyte Gulf had effectively decided the fate of the Pacific War. The Japanese Navy, once the most feared in Asia, was now a shadow of its former self. Fuel shortages, lack of air cover, and crumbling morale ensured that no major fleet action would ever be mounted again. Japan's surviving ships became floating fortresses anchored in harbors, waiting for an invasion that would never come. And as the American task forces pressed onward toward Luzon, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, one message spread quietly among U.S. sailors. A line repeated in mess halls and ready rooms. The battleships died in the Sibuyan Sea. That single sentence captured what history would later confirm. In less than 24 hours, air power had ended the era of naval giants. In the days that followed the sinking of Musashi, the Imperial Navy was no longer the same force that had once swept through the Pacific. Its admirals spoke quietly, their confidence replaced by weary silence. For years, they had believed that steel, armor, and gunnery would decide the fate of nations. Now, they had watched those beliefs go down with 5 great ships in a single day, drowned beneath the rising age of air power. When the official reports reached Tokyo, they read like an obituary. The center force had lost Musashi, Chikuma, Suzuya, Chokai, and several destroyers. Nearly 3,000 sailors were dead. Others would later die of wounds and exhaustion as their crippled ships limped back to base. Fuel reserves were nearly gone. What remained of the fleet could no longer sortie beyond home waters. And for the first time, the emperor himself was briefed on the full scale of the disaster. Inside the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito listened in silence. Witnesses recalled that he simply lowered his head, asking only one question. Is the Navy still capable of protecting the homeland? No one could answer. The admirals bowed deeply, not out of ceremony, but out of grief. They knew the truth. Japan's last chance to repel the U.S. advance had slipped beneath the Sibuyan Sea. In Washington, the victory was analyzed not just as a battle, but as a transformation. Naval planners who had once debated the relevance of battleships now had their answer written in burning oil and twisted steel. The carrier era had begun in absolute dominance. Every major power took note. Britain accelerated construction of new carriers. The Soviet Union quietly began studying U.S. carrier doctrine. Even nations far from the Pacific realized that the world seas had changed forever. For Japan, the consequences were immediate and devastating. Without its major battleships, it could no longer challenge U.S. naval operations in open waters. American carrier groups now roamed the Pacific unopposed, launching strikes deep into the Philippines, Formosa, and the Ryukyus. Merchant convoys bringing fuel and supplies to Japan became easy prey. By early 1945, the Imperial Navy was confined to its harbors, trapped, starved, and powerless. Among the surviving sailors of Musashi, the memory of that day never faded. Years later, survivors spoke of the ship's last moments as both tragedy and lesson. One recalled, "We believed no bomb could sink her. We learned the sea does not respect belief." Another described how, as the ship rolled, the crew sang the national anthem softly, their voices drowned by the sound of rushing water. These testimonies, recorded decades later, gave human weight to what had been seen by history as a tactical statistic. For the men who lived it, it was not strategy, it was loss, sacrifice, and the death of everything they had been taught to believe in. In the West, newspapers carried the story with bold headlines. Japan's super battleship sunk, U.S. air power reigns supreme. Editorials celebrated the victory but also marveled at the implications. If aircraft could destroy the world's largest battleship in hours, what did that mean for the future of war itself? The answer, though few could yet grasp it fully, was simple. Technology, not size, would now decide who ruled the seas. In the months that followed, Japan's naval command shifted to desperate defense. Fuel shortages grew catastrophic. Ships were ordered to remain anchored to conserve oil. Even the legendary Yamato, Musashi's surviving sister ship, was eventually sent on a one-way suicide mission, Operation Tengo, in April 1945. She too was sunk by waves of carrier aircraft before ever reaching Okinawa. The fate of Musashi had been a grim preview of what awaited them all. For the Americans, the battle confirmed that their doctrine, combining mobility, intelligence, and air supremacy, was unassailable. Every major engagement after Leyte Gulf would reinforce that truth. When historians later called Leyte the last great naval battle, it was because no fleet of battleships would ever meet in open combat again. The world had crossed a line from which there was no return. And in Japan, as the war drew toward its fiery end, the name Musashi became a whispered reminder of courage, of pride, and of the moment when a nation's faith in steel met the reality of the modern age. Her wreck would remain undiscovered for decades, resting in the depths of the Sibuyan Sea, a silent monument to the twilight of the battleship era. In the quiet that followed the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the sea reclaimed its calm. The oil slicks faded, the wrecks sank into darkness, and silence covered what had once been a thunderous battlefield. Yet beneath that silence, something irreversible had changed, not just in strategy, but in the very soul of naval warfare. For centuries, the battleship had been the symbol of national power, a floating fortress, part weapon and part monument. To build one was to declare greatness. To lose one was to feel humiliation. But the Sibuyan Sea proved a truth the world had long resisted. That size, armor, and tradition could no longer protect against speed, intelligence, and the sky. It was not the steel hulls that decided the future, but the invisible hands of technology and adaptation. The loss of Musashi was more than a military defeat. It was the end of an idea that wars could be won by sheer might, by towering guns and the illusion of invincibility. When she sank, she carried with her not only 1,000 men, but the belief that empires could rule through spectacle alone. The sea, indifferent and eternal, swallowed both the ship and the pride that built her. For the United States, the battle was validation, proof that the new era belonged to those who mastered the air and the unseen. For Japan, it was a reckoning, a reminder that courage without adaptation is tragedy. And for the world, it was a lesson that no weapon, however powerful, remains supreme for long. Today, the name Musashi still echoes among historians, divers, and sailors, not as a relic of failure, but as a monument to human ambition. She was the peak of a dying age, a masterpiece built for a world that had already moved on. In her fall, we see both the brilliance and the blindness of war, the drive to build the greatest, and the failure to see what comes next. And so, as the waves roll endlessly over the Sibuyan Sea, one truth endures, that every empire meets its turning point not in fire or glory, but in the moment it refuses to change.